Okay, so I'd like to welcome our next speaker, who is Professor Mario Thevis. Ready and waiting, wonderful. And you're going to talk to us today about sports drug testing. Wonderful.
That's right. Thanks very much for the invitation, for allowing me to speak here today. And the closest I will get to breathe or breath is actually that we can do sports drug testing in exhaled breath, but I'm not talking about that today. I would like to talk a little bit about our daily work and just to remind you, if you haven't seen that before, there are certain laboratories worldwide that are accredited to do sports drug testing. One is down here in London. There's another one in Cologne, where I'm from, and there are 30 in total accredited worldwide. A few others lost their accreditation for various reasons. Might be financial reasons, but also non-conformities, as one laboratory east from here experienced recently. We do have around 300,000 samples tested every year worldwide, mostly blood and urine. I mentioned breath could be an alternative, but it is not yet. And those samples come in all different colors, literally. You wouldn't believe, but the samples I'm showing you here are real doping control samples. And it is irritating when you open the boxes and you look at a green sample or a red sample, you inevitably ask yourself how the athlete looks like, but we never know because these samples are coded. And I can tell you also the color doesn't mean an athlete is doped or not. So that's not of any help either. But those are regular doping control samples. And we test for everything which the World Anti-Doping Agency calls prohibited. And that's listed in an annually issued document, the prohibited list. And just very briefly, everything which is not clinically approved is not supposed to be used as a drug in any way, and certainly not to be found in an athlete's organism. And just one regular example, you might have heard of our anabolic agents, anabolic steroids. Athletes are unfortunately tested positive for many of those, just as brief examples. The protocol is like when you have an athlete tested positive, the athlete can come in and the athlete can give a statement. How did it end up with the adverse finding? And I leave it up to you to decide whether you would think this is a plausible explanation or not. An athlete tested positive for an anti-cancer drug, in this case, letrozole, and she argued that her grandmother is using that drug for therapeutic reasons. And while she's cooking also for her granddaughter, she must have dropped one of those pills into the pot of noodles while she was cooking. She didn't realize, she cooked it anyway, served it to the athlete, and so she ingested the prohibited substance. Her explanation, again, you decide whether you believe it or not. The other case I would like to share with you is even a little more odd. This athlete tested positive for EPO. It's a drug that stimulates the production of red blood cells. Breathing of the organism is supported. But that drug has to be administered by injection. You cannot eat it inadvertently. So she said, I know how that happens. I was exercising in an industrial area. I'm running a lot, and there's pharmaceutical industry around. And apparently that industry put their waste, their garbage onto the street. And then there must have been a heavy rainfall. The garbage accumulated in puddles. I ran through it. The water splashed onto my pants, and that's how I ended up doped positive. You decide. Spoiler alert, the jury didn't follow that argument. And then there are situations, I'm not sure if you can see it properly, but on the right lower end, there's an athlete literally caught with a needle in his arm still attached with a blood bag. So there's little room for argumentation. This athlete doped, and there was no way around that. And if you're in the possession of that material, these are photos from an organized raid in Europe. Those are all doping agents. You can hardly argue this is all for your own well-being. It's most likely doping, but less so on an elite athlete's level, probably more on a recreational level. Nevertheless, we are entitled to improve our test methods. And this is just an overview from the 1960s to the 2020s, where we are with the harmonized doping controls started in the early 1960s with stimulants, narcotics mostly, and then a lot of new drugs, drug candidates, methods of doping were added to it, and that is what we are currently taking care of. It wouldn't be that easy if there weren't any influencing factors. Anti-doping regulations are one, analytical advances, therapeutic advances, and then we heard about exposure earlier, and the athlete is exposed to a lot of chemicals and residues as well. And it has a different effect. It's less an health effect, but more a job-related effect. So if we start, for instance, with anti-doping regulations, it is an administrative nightmare. We are in a safe environment here, right? I'm allowed to say that. But there are quite a lot of regulations which we have to follow, and they influence the analytical approaches that we are following. Meaning, this is just one example. We started, as one example, with clenbuterol testing in 1992. And on the upper left corner, you can see a dot, a blue dot that indicates our detection level, 2.5 nanograms per milliliter. That's 10 to the minus 9 grams per milliliter. That detection level dropped in 6 years to 0.02 nanograms per milliliter. It's a factor of 100, better than before. And another 14 years later, in 2012, we were down to 1 picogram per milliliter. Just to give you a number, 2,500 times better than 20 years before, which is good. We want to be as sensitive as possible to detect the cheaters in sports. And that introduction into doping controls with the different substance shown here allows us to improve our testing strategies in general. This is for an anabolic steroid data from Cologne. Before 2012, we had a certain testing strategy, and that allowed us to identify between 0 and 4 cheating athletes per year with that substance. It's not a lot, but it was what it was. And then new technologies, new knowledge about the drug excretion metabolism came up, and with the same clientele we were testing, we had 82 findings a year later. So improving our test methods was good. And then there was a certain, let's say, evolutionary adaptation to the new situation. So there weren't that many findings anymore, but we now know they are not using the drug anymore because our testing is really good. So goal accomplished. That summary, you don't have to read it in detail, is from the London 2012 Olympic Games. There was a so-called retesting program. The samples collected at the time of the Olympic Games were tested on site. There were 8 adverse findings at the time of the Games, and the samples were then stored for 10 years. And they were reanalyzed with new methods, better technologies, and in total, 73 adverse findings came up. And 31 medals were reallocated. Gold medal, silver medal, bronze medal, they were all redistributed because the athletes were found cheating with improved test methods. Again, good news, I think. But we have to keep in mind therapeutic advances, which are also good. Just one set of information from Germany. In 1996, we had around 3,500 daily doses, defined daily doses as antihypertensive drugs, diuretics, quite common everywhere. And that tripled until 2020. So there's a lot more of those drugs in the environment being subject of exposure. So we have to keep that in mind as well, because athletes are exposed to tiny little amounts of chemicals, drugs, metabolites all the time. And then keeping in mind, we are getting better and better with our analytical sensitivity. It might well be that regardless, whoever in this room I will test, I might find a doping agent. And you don't even know about it because it is what it is. And that is how it is usually illustrated. There are a lot of environmental stressors, which can affect health, as we learned earlier, but which can also affect your athletic career in a negative way. And this is just one example here, clenbuterol. I mentioned the improved sensitivity by 2,500 earlier. In selected countries, Mexico, China, South Africa, that is a legitimate growth promoter given to animals to make them grow faster, to produce more meat. But unfortunately, that meat contains tiny amounts of clenbuterol. And now you eat the meat as an athlete, you test positive, inevitably. And that has to be reflected in the anti-doping regulations again, and making our life as an analytical chemist a little more difficult. So let's take an analytical chemist. Nobody cares if I eat meat or if I drink milk. I'm drug tested, but it doesn't matter because I'm not an athlete. But athletes need to be aware of a lot of sources of contamination. I'm not going into details here, but growth promoters, legal or illegal growth promoters, are a major concern. And that is where we have to be wary of it, to make sure that athletes are not tested positive for unknown reasons for them. Supplements, dietary supplements. I would guess, at least in Germany, 60% of the population use dietary supplements in one or other way. for athletic reasons, or even for just minerals, vitamins, you name it. They are quite frequently contaminated or even adulterated with doping agents, and that's not declared on the label, so you run a certain risk. And intimate contact has also been argued quite frequently. If my partner uses a prohibited substance, it might well be that I'm exposed to tiny amounts, and that could end up in a positive test. So we heard that earlier. It is very difficult to say you're doped or you're not doped just by an excuse that somebody brings forward, because everyone who tests positive always says, I didn't do anything wrong. I could swear. And that's why the Court of Arbitration put it elegantly in these words. The currency of denial is devalued by the fact that it's the common coin of the guilty and the innocent, and we need scientific evidence to work with that. And I have two short examples where the scientific evidence, luckily, could be provided. 3 fencers exercising, competing in Africa, testing positive for a diuretic drug, obsolete, almost impossible to get hold of, but they tested positive. And that led to further investigations. What did these 3 athletes have in common other than being in Africa? They said, well, we had malaria prophylaxis, but that is not prohibited. And they said, yes, you're right, it's not prohibited. So maybe the drugs were contaminated with a diuretic. They were not. Maybe it converts in the human metabolism. That is the active drug on the upper left corner, and the diuretic is at the lower right corner. There's a structural similarity, but the metabolism from one to the other is not shown in the literature. And now we went a little further and thought, what are the metabolites? The metabolites shown in the literature are shown here. Just take an idea of the pictures. You don't have to go into details. But the subpopulation of athletes is very prone to a creatine-rich diet. And we heard about formaldehyde earlier. If you have formaldehyde as an athlete using a lot of creatine in your bladder, in your urine, and this malaria prophylaxis drug, it chemically reacts in your bladder to the diuretic. You don't ingest the diuretic, it doesn't circulate, it doesn't operate, but you test positive by exposure. That was one example. Luckily, we could clear the athletes. And that brings me to my last example. It's clomiphene. Clomiphene is a drug that is used in fertility clinics because females produce more eggs, and that helps getting pregnant. But it's also a doping agent for males in particular, and we do see a considerable increase in clomiphene findings per year. And the question then was, could that be an environmental contamination as well? Because we're always finding tiny little amounts. And then there were literature articles describing that laying hens are provided with clomiphene because also they produce more eggs when they get that drug. And we thought that is a nice study we could follow up upon. So we had 24 laying hens treated with clomiphene for 28 days. And then we collected their eggs for 14 days. That now takes 14 days. I hope that's okay. Collect the eggs. And then the eggs were analyzed and the eggs were consumed, and we analyzed the urine sample of the volunteers taking part in that study. And sure enough, the eggs contained clomiphene in considerable amounts, not pharmacologically relevant, but easily detected by mass spectrometry. And also the athletes tested positive. This is a chromatogram, how a positive person would look like. Eating eggs, which is the middle pane, and having the drug as such is the lower pane. It looks almost identical, but we digged a little further, and the hen metabolism is different from the human metabolism, luckily. So we could differentiate eventually by analytical chemistry, is that a contamination scenario, or is it a drug use scenario, which would be doping in our context. And with that, I would like to encourage everyone to look into chemistry and environmental stressor. And I thank you very much for your attention.